Hey everyone. So in this video, I wanted to talk about a article that was published on The Guardian on the 29th of July 2020. It's all about the change to the rules about the number of substitutes and the size of the substitutes bench in the Premier League and other leagues around the world. The article, to me, is really doesn't prove its point at all, and I'm quite surprised that A, it's even being argued, and B, that it's kind of being thrown up here without any kind of ability to comment on that. I've got it all in front of us here so we can read through this together, and I just want to give a few reactions to it really, and bring up some counterpoints of my own, and just get people's views on it. So here we go. Um, this all comes about before we start reading um, because of the COVID outbreak. So the Premier League and other leagues around the world for football were suspended, and when they resumed, there was a worry about player fitness and just looking to protect players following quite a lengthy break in the season, get them going full notch again. And part of the ways to kind of ameliorate that was to allow there to be more substitutes. So normally you have a maximum of three from seven, and that was changed from five to nine. And the rest of that season has now played out. It was recently announced, though, that this rule was going to continue next year. Obviously, the worry around COVID is still there, it hasn't gone away. But there were a few clubs which were not too happy about this idea. And this article, in a sense, is kind of calling them out and saying that they are actually kind of being naive in a sense because while they were voting against not doing this, it actually benefits them. So it's trying to make the argument that having more subs actually benefits the so called smaller clubs. And this is the argument as we're going to go through. But as I said, I pretty disagree pretty strongly with this, and I'll try and explain why in amongst. It's written by an academic. I think he's at LSE, and he has worked in football before. You can see there for Athletic Bilbao, head of talent ID. So should know what he's talking about really. So he's trying to explain why the issue is not as simple as it appears, which I get that, but he's kind of actually saying it's completely counter to what everyone else is saying. So it starts off last month. I was chatting to my friend Ernesto Valverde, the former Athletic Bilbao and Barcelona coach who I got to know well when I was Athletics head of talent ID. For once, we were disagreeing. He, like many in football, thought that the temporary rule change to allow five substitutions for an extended bench of nine players favoured the big clubs. I insisted it wouldn't. At the time, it felt like the debate didn't matter much either way, given the rule was only expected to last until the end of the season. Now, however, IFAB has agreed to extend it to the dismay of many. Burnley's manager Sean Dyche and Aston Villa's Dean Smith are prominent critics, and one well-regarded journalist recently claimed it, quote, really does not take the brains of Lloyd George to work out that it is a rule that will favour the richer clubs who have squads packed with large number of higher quality players. However, the issue really is not as simple as it appears on the surface. Let me explain why. Alright, here we go. My starting point is this. If being able to use five substitutes favoured the big clubs, you would expect them to make more changes compared with smaller teams. However, since the season resumed, that hasn't been the case. After lockdown was relaxed in the Bundesliga, for instance, the top four teams used 4.03 substitutes per game, while the bottom four teams used 4.59. In the Premier League, Manchester City and Chelsea used fewer substitutes on average than Bournemouth and Norwich. So what is going on? My argument is that the change in number of substitutions neither harms nor benefits the teams according to their quality, but depends on other considerations. Okay, so I'd say at this point that there's sort of two things about this. The first, it seems like this is quite a selective sample. So he's highlighted two teams that finished in the top four and put them against two teams that finished in the bottom three. and said that the teams in the bottom three actually used more substitutes, but we don't know the number, than the two that finished in the top. I'd be highly surprised, though, if it isn't possible to pick out teams at the top of the division that use a lot of substitutions. So I actually went to look at um, information about how many subs each team makes, and this is the table of number of subs at the point before lockdown. So, quite interestingly, one of the sources for information about this was a fantasy football website because they're obviously worried about how much, when the game was about to resume, how much those clubs would rotate players now that they had more substitutes. And in a fantasy football team, you're obviously picking players who you need to be on the pitch in order for them to gain any points at all. And so they were trying to factor this in, which I think is a really nice point to make. But if you look at this table, it's quite interesting. So the very top team who eventually won the league are Liverpool. And one of the teams mentioned as having a high number of subs, Norwich, post lockdown, have a high number of subs before the lockdown. Chelsea are pretty high up there. Bournemouth are way down the bottom. So I don't think you can really draw too much into just because you can make five subs, it only matters whether you do or not. He's trying to sort of suggest that teams that didn't do very well post lockdown in the Premier League used more subs on average, which may be true, but that still doesn't mean that they were actually benefited by being able to have more subs as opposed to the bigger teams. And as I said, I'm pretty sure that Liverpool would probably continue to do that number of subs, but I'd need to see that analysis. But the point is, it doesn't matter. Even if you take this as true and say that actually the top teams all tended to use less subs than the bottom teams, that doesn't prove that they aren't being benefited by having the ability to do more. It's probably more like, in my eyes, that those teams down at the bottom who are starting to use more subs, so Bournemouth, you see, went right up that chart from being pretty low down on subs to higher up, are just desperate. They're trying to change things to win games. The bigger teams will tend to be winning games and won't need to change things. But then Liverpool do because there's games where they use all five subs because they were desperate to bring on youth players to give them enough games to get a league winners medal. So it's certainly not as simple as what he's suggesting, but his argument is completely flawed. Whether it is impactful for the big teams or not, you can't tell that by just how many they looked at it. It doesn't follow. It's not a logically sound argument. Let's move on though. Let me explain using a scenario I have discussed with a number of coaches, players, and analysts in the Premier League and La Liga. It is far simpler than real life, but hopefully it captures the essence of the situation. Let's take two hypothetical situations. In situation A, substitutions during the game are forbidden. Teams start and end the game with 11 players. In situation B, meanwhile, it is mandatory to replace the starting 11 at half time, and no other substitutions are allowed. Going from A, no subs, to B, all subs, means going from 0 to 11 substitutions, something undoubtedly much more drastic than going from 3 to 5. In situation B, each team experienced a change in the quality of its players in the second half. Difference between the second half and the first half depends only on how good each team's substitutes are relative to the starting 11. In other words, whether a given team benefits given depends on how its own relative change compares with the relative change of its opponents. Note that the words strong team or weak team are not used here, and therefore whether one team has a better or worse squad than another is irrelevant. Let me put it another way. Let's assume that every team's first team and substitutes bench has a quality that is measurable and can be assigned a number from 0 to 100, with 100 being best. Now imagine a match between a strong and a weak team, in which all the players are replaced at half time. The strong team has 11 players of quality 100 and 11 who are 60. On the other hand, a weak team has 22 identical players, all of quality equal to 20. When the starting players have to be replaced at the break, the strong team plays with quality 100 in the first half and quality 60 in the second half, while the weak team plays with quality 20 in both halves. Contrary to what many might think, under these conditions, it's clear that the weaker team prefers a situation where there are more substitutions. So this is a completely ridiculous scenario that's a kind of like straw man for this whole thing. It just makes absolutely no sense at all. The first point is with substitutions, you are not forced to make them. So in the real game, it's a completely different scenario than this. Yes, if you had to replace your whole team at half time, there's a chance that a weaker team might have a more even squad. But even then, I'd argue that they probably don't. The weaker teams would probably drop down in quality as well. And you've got no way of kind of knowing that. But it's a completely like crazy scenario. It doesn't happen. It's not football, and it's not what anyone is saying. If substitutions were enforced, then there might be something in this. But when they're not, it's a completely spurious thing to even talk about. So, what actually is going on in these games? Well, I've mentioned Liverpool, and this article has mentioned Aston Villa. Let's just actually have a look at a game that was played post lockdown at Anfield. The game finished 2-0 to Liverpool, and you can see both of the goals were actually scored fairly late on. Let's actually have a look at some of the timeline here. So if I just scroll back, we've got half time. Liverpool nil, Aston Villa nil. No subs have been used at this point. Then all of a sudden, in the 60th minute, we get Liverpool making three substitutions. And they're all three substitutions of really, really high quality. All three of these players, Wijnaldum, Henderson, and Firmino, would no doubt be in the starting 11 of a weaker team like Aston Villa. But for Liverpool, they can sit on the bench, and the manager has the luxury of bringing on all three at once to change the tide of the game. Now, if he was limited to three subs, he could still have done this, absolutely. But by having two more subs in the bag, it's even easier for a big club to do this. Aston Villa have nowhere near this quality of player sat on their subs bench. So they've been held nil-nil. Villa playing their hearts out. Liverpool not exactly bursting into a sweat. They were the runaway winners of the league. But they can make a change like this, go on and score two goals. You can see Villa make some substitutions after that. There's two Villa substitutions, which are basically like for like players, although they haven't actually swapped them in here. So we had striker for striker, winger for winger. Certainly not really upgrades, about the same quality. Another sub for Villa, another sub for Liverpool. One of the Liverpool subs scores, and Liverpool make yet another sub. So Liverpool have made five subs in this game, Villa have made three. But part of that, as I said, was because Liverpool wanted to give some of their younger players the appearances they need in order to get a winners' medal. They'd won the league by this point, didn't really matter to them. They were looking to as many points as they can, of course. But the key difference is this triple substitution. And this is the kind of thing that a big club can do. The actual interesting thing about football is, as covered by this book, it's what they call a weak link game, where actually it isn't the super quality of your team that matters. It tends to be who has the relative weak links when sides play. And so it's not fair to say that throwing on 11 subs even would make that much of a difference between there, because it's what controls the outcome of the game more often than not is not your very, very best players, but where you have the weak links in the team. And of course, often those best players can exploit the weak links. But the point is, if you've got one superstar in your team, which again Aston Villa could be argued to have with Jack Grealish, there's only so much he can do because he's relying on everyone else to get him the ball. So soccer is a pretty low scoring game. Players don't have that much possession overall. In order for Grealish to get on the ball, he has to be provided the ball in good situations. Too often for Villa, he's getting it deep and trying to do too much. He was called out for holding onto the ball too long, but part of that is because he doesn't have those forward players making the intelligent runs for him to find, and he's holding it. And if there are any mistakes, then those are the things which are pounced upon. So really, it's not about having your strong team; it's about having no weak links in order to succeed. And having a bigger bench enables you to plug any gaps you want. It enables you to be much more tactical because you can prepare for numerous scenarios. Let's keep going through this though. Of course, Team B has a low chance of winning throughout. I'm not disputing that. But crucially, their chances of winning go up when 11 changes are made. The reason is that it's been a much more homogeneous squad, one with more similar player quality, is able to make more like for like substitutions. Again, I would kind of disagree that the weaker sides, in inverted commas, have more equal squads than the bigger sides. They will tend to have two or three players who are good enough to play in sides maybe 10 places above them in the league, but they'll have a few which are certainly not able to make that step up. And it's those weak links that really hold them back. Whereas the big teams tend to have pretty much quality all the way through, as seen by that Liverpool game. The three subs that they made were three players who were amazingly high quality. Um, and so their squad is pretty strong all the way through. The weaker squads probably have similar profiles, but the drop off is far more pronounced, and that's the thing that's important. Here's another scenario. All players in the strong team have an identical quality equal to 50, while the weak team has a quality of 20 in its first 11 and of 15 in its 11 substitutes. Here again, the more homogeneous team, which is this case is the strong team, benefits most from a situation where there are more substitutions allowed. So he's making the same point there. But what he isn't proving is that the weaker teams actually do have a more homogeneous squad. I would say that they don't. If you look at squads of clubs, there just aren't that many good players at those weaker clubs. They'll have two or three who are really good. They'll have a lot of mediocre, and they'll have some which are pretty poor. Big teams will have a few superstars, but their benches will still be pretty much better than anything else that other teams can put out. Look at Man City and look at Chelsea. They're two of the teams that are named in this. Those benches would start in most of those weaker team games. And it's all about, in football, the weak links. That's the key. And those smaller, weaker teams have too many weak links, and that's why they don't play very well. These simple exercises capture the essence of the impact of rule change. Well, I'm not sure they do, but a team's strength does not matter. Squads that can make more like for like substitutions are the ones that will benefit most from the possibility of greater number of substitutions, regardless of their riches and the overall level of quality of the squad. More uneven squads suffer from the rule change, regardless of how good their overall squad is. Again, he hasn't actually discussed the rule change. He's discussing his you must make 11 subs at half time rule change, which isn't the rule change. I'm going to argue that the bigger clubs just have a lot more flexibility in terms of what they can do with their substitutes. They can actually have more options. They can start players to rest those star players if they need to. They can bring them on when they need to. We saw numerous times Man City bringing on De Bruyne towards the end of games. He'd go on and create assists, score goals because he's that good. It's simply kind of ridiculous to say that 11 changes at halftime is in any way like the current situation, and B, to make the sort of accusation that the bigger clubs have way more uneven squads when I just don't think that there's any case of that. At this point, you're probably thinking, well, your theory sounds all well and good, Professor, but in practice, the big clubs have more homogeneous squads than smaller ones. Well, he's kind of made my point there. He says, I wouldn't be so sure. There's a well known effect in football, which economists refer to as a superstar phenomenon, whereby a small number of people earn enormous amounts and dominate the activities in which they engage. Of course, it is not specific to football or even sports. There are countless examples from the world of arts and letters and showbiz where there is a strong tendency for rewards to be highly skewed towards the top most talented individuals in the activity, with very large rewards at the top and marked skewness in the distribution of salaries. Fine. Nearly 40 years ago, Sherwin Rosen, an economist from the University of Chicago, proposed a brilliant theory to explain these general patterns. Applied to football, it means that essentially the best players reap a greater share of payroll, and this reduces the spoils available to the relatively less gifted in the squad. The superstar phenomenon, therefore, tends to increase the salary inequality both within squads and across squads. As salaries are associated with quality and performance, this pushes richer clubs to tend to have more uneven squads than lesser, in terms of money. Clubs, sorry, see what he's saying. They have more uneven squads than lesser clubs. Richer clubs would then benefit less, not more, and tend to use fewer substitutes, which is what is happening. Of course, it would make sense to go through each squad individually to make sure this is the case. So, again, this is an argument which is a bit of a straw man. The amount of money that players are paid at different clubs doesn't really depend on their quality. You can't just look at someone and say, oh, he's paid X, therefore he must be really good. There are lots of examples of players who are on ridiculous contracts who aren't even playing for their teams. And there's other examples of players who aren't paid very much at all, e.g., they're very young, but they're having a huge impact and are due a pay rise. But he's kind of saying that football has a situation where there's a really talented players for those top teams, but that goes against what is said by these economists. What they're saying is what matters is not your best players, but your worst players. And so what we see in the Premier League is yes, those top four teams have standout players, but they also have quality in every position and they have quality all over their bench. And even if it means that if you have a sort of talent grade, their standard deviation is slightly higher than a lower club, it isn't the same effect because it isn't what matters. What matters is what's going on with your worst players. And that's where the lesser clubs can't keep a squad which is as even as those. He says himself he'd have to go through all of the squads and look at it. And I think that would be a very good idea because I don't see a lot of balance in those lower teams. I see, as I said, one or two really good players who are going to get snapped up from teams that are relegated. The rest of them are not. So there's a huge inequality in those teams as well. There's inequality in all teams. The point is that the bigger teams do a better job of getting their weaker links to a higher level, and that's what matters. This isn't a sport like basketball where one star player can just be on the ball all the time and dominate. Players get a limited amount of touches, they get a limited amount of time on the ball. It's fairly low scoring, and so actually what matters most is the tail end rather than the top end. Finishes by saying, incidentally, reports have suggested that only Aston Villa, Bournemouth, and West Ham voted against the rule change. But if they have a relatively more balanced squad, they should have been among those to vote in favour. Well, I don't think they do. That's the point. I mean, Bournemouth squad has a few players who are really good, a lot of players who you wouldn't be able to name, and a bench with hardly anything. Same with Villa. They have a few players who are good enough to play in top 10 teams. They have some players who are okay, and they have a lot of players that you wouldn't even want to bring them on. West Ham have probably got a stronger bench out of any of them. But again, it's a lot of players who really haven't performed in the Premier League. And so again, I'd say there's quite a lot of difference in these sort of Declan Rice kind of characters who are being targeted by the top four, and a lot of others who cost a lot of money and have a lot of wages, but they just haven't actually produced with the goods. And that's why you could argue that West Ham are lower down in the league. Anyway, I thought this was all very interesting. I was really quite surprised that it got published because it seems to me just so weak in terms of its argument. There's only really two things that are being pushed here. The first is that if you have to make all of your subs at half time, then it's better if you have a more even squad than one that isn't. Which, again, I think you could actually not agree with, and I'd be fairly happy to support that. So it's fairly easy to argue against that. But in any case, it's not a very good point because it's nothing like reality. And the second one, which is actually comes first in the argument, is that, well, if it did favour the big clubs, they'd be using more subs, which again misses the point. It's not about having to throw on 5 players, it's about having the options. It's about having suddenly 9 quality players on your bench if you're a big club versus looking around as a small club going, ooh, I wonder which youth players will make it this week. And yeah, we can't really use them, but I guess they're there. So it's completely misguided in my view. Um, I would certainly agree, although he doesn't really name him or give any backup, that the person who said it doesn't sort of take a brains of Lloyd George to work out that it favours richest clubs. I mean, I think I agree with that. But what does everyone else think? I'd be interested to see some comments on this. Um, anyway, thank you very much for watching and goodbye.